There was a time when I thought John was the perfect guy for me. We were college sweethearts, and he was everything I ever wanted. But as time passed, I saw a side of him that scared me. He was possessive, controlling, and his bursts of anger were getting more frequent. I knew I had to end it, for my own safety. Breaking up with John was tough. He didn't take it well, and his reaction was way worse than I'd ever imagined. He begged, pleaded, and when that didn't work, he threatened. I blocked him on all social media, changed my phone number, and tried to move on. A few weeks after our breakup, I started noticing strange things. I'd come home to find my mailbox open, with the letters inside shuffled around. I would find small items in my apartment move slightly from their original positions. It was subtle, but something was off. I brushed it off as stress, my mind playing tricks on me. But one evening, as I was coming home from work, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. John's car. I felt my heart drop. Was he following me? Days turned into weeks, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I would see John's car more often, near my work, my apartment, and even the grocery store. I started receiving anonymous calls at all hours of the day and night. There was never anyone on the other line, just eerie silence. I was scared. I felt like I was losing my mind. One night after a late shift at work, I returned to my apartment completely drained. As I turned the key in the lock, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it in the morning. As I pushed the door open, a gust of cold wind rushed past me. My apartment was in complete darkness, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. I reached for the switch, but as the lights flickered on, I froze. My apartment was trashed. Furniture was overturned, pictures were torn down from the walls. My belongings were scattered all over the floor. I felt my knees buckle as I sank to the floor, my body shaking with fear. I was being stalked. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. John was back, and he had been in my home. After discovering the trashed state of my apartment, I knew I had to act. I called the police, my hands shaking as I explained the situation. The police were prompt, and they took my statement. They advised me to stay with a friend for a while and said they would increase patrols in my area. I was too scared to stay at my apartment, so I decided to stay with my friend Lisa. Lisa's place was a small but cozy house on the other side of the city. She welcomed me in, understanding the gravity of the situation. For a few days, things seemed to calm down. No sign of John's car, no creepy calls. I began to breathe easily. But that peace was short-lived. One evening, after Lisa had left for her night shift, I was home alone. I was sitting in the living room watching a movie to distract myself when I heard a noise. It was a soft tap-tap-taps against the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, growing louder. I slowly turned towards the window and my heart nearly stopped. There, peering through the glass, was John. His eyes were wide and wild, a sick grin on his face. I screamed and ran towards the phone, but as I dialed the police, I heard the shattering of glass from the living room. John was in the house. I ran into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The sound of John's footsteps echoed through the silent house. Then the pounding started. John was trying to break down the bathroom door. I could hear him grunting with effort, the sound of his fists against the door making me flinch. I huddled in the corner of the bathroom, clutching the phone as the operator assured me help was on the way. The pounding on the door grew louder and then suddenly stopped. I held my breath, listening for any sound. Then I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police had arrived. John was arrested that night. The police found him lurking outside Lisa's house. He was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and harassment. He got a restraining order and was sentenced to jail. The experience left me shaken, but I was just glad it was over. I was safe now from John at least. But the experience has forever changed me. It's a scary reminder of how a person you once cared for can become your worst nightmare. It was a sunny afternoon, a typical pickup time for my 7-year-old son Ryan from school. I was a few minutes early, so I waited in the car, parked just across the street from the school's entrance. While waiting, I saw a man I had never seen before lurking around the school entrance. He was tall, dressed in a long, tattered coat, even though it was a warm day. His hat was pulled down, hiding his face, but he kept glancing around nervously, which made me uncomfortable. As kids began to spill out of the school, I noticed the man's behavior change. He started pacing, his eyes darting from one child to another. Alarm bells started ringing in my head when I saw him moving closer to the kids. Ryan came out of the school doors then, his backpack bouncing as he ran towards my car. But then, he stopped. The man had approached him, kneeling down to his level and talking to him. I felt my heart pound in my chest. Without a second thought, I bolted from the car. As I sprinted towards Ryan and the man, my mind was racing. I couldn't make out what they were talking about, but Ryan looked uneasy. The man seemed to be trying to coax Ryan into going with him, but my son was hesitant, stepping back. Just as I was a few feet away, the man grabbed Ryan's arm, trying to pull him away. I shouted, my voice echoing across the silent street. The man looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, and Ryan managed to pull his arm free. I scooped Ryan up, my heart pounding, and held him close. The man was quick to recover. He jumped up and started to run, but I wasn't about to let him get away. "Help! This man tried to take my son!" I yelled. Some parents and teachers who were nearby rushed over. A few of them chased after the man while others called the police. The school went into lockdown while the police searched the area. Ryan was shaken but thankfully unharmed. He told me the man had promised him a puppy if he would go with him. It broke my heart that someone would use such a trick to lure a child. The man was caught later that day trying to leave town. It turned out he was a known criminal with a history of abductions. The school tightened its security measures, and all the parents were extra vigilant from that day on. That day was a stark reminder of the world's dangers and the importance of teaching our children about stranger danger. My son's school day had almost turned into a nightmare, but luckily, we were able to avoid a terrible fate. When I was 22, I moved into my first solo apartment. It was an old building, tucked away in a part of the city that was quiet enough for my tastes. The rent was cheap, which was a plus for a recent college grad like me. But the trade-off was the place was a bit run down. The hallways always smelled like old damp wood. The paint on the walls was peeling, and my neighbors, well, they were a mixed bag of weird and reclusive. But I didn't mind. I was proud. It was my place, my independence. I had spent the first few weeks setting it up, trying to turn the worn-out flat into a home. Little did I know that my feeling of safety was about to be shattered. On Wednesday night, I was sitting on my worn-out couch, deep in a thriller novel. The only sound in the apartment was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional blare of a car horn from the street. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound, almost like scratching. It was coming from the direction of my front door. I put my book down, thinking it was probably a neighbor having trouble with their key, but as I strained my ears, I noticed that the noise was not going away. In fact, it was growing louder. I got up and slowly walked towards the door, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The scratching became more intense, now accompanied by a soft thud, like something heavy being pressed against the door. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, telling me it had to be someone's misguided attempt at a prank or a drunken neighbor who lost their way. But the noises didn't stop. They became louder and more persistent, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Taking a deep breath, I leaned against the door and called out, "Who's there?" The scratching stopped abruptly, followed by an eerie silence that sent shivers down my spine. I waited for what seemed like an eternity, but there was no reply. Then all of a sudden, I heard a voice. It was low and guttural. "Open the door." I felt my blood run cold. It was not a voice I recognized, and it was certainly not a friendly one. Something inside me screamed to call the cops, but I was paralyzed with fear. "Who are you? What do you want?" I managed to croak out. There was another pause, then the voice responded, "You have something I want." At this point, I was completely freaked out. The voice sounded menacing, and the vague statement made my mind race with possible scenarios. I backed away from the door and quickly called the police when they answered. I whispered my situation and addressed it to the operator, who assured me help was on the way. But as I ended the call, I heard a new sound that made my heart drop: the turning of the door handle. The intruder was trying to break in. As the door handle started to jingle violently, I retreated further into my apartment. My mind was racing, and my heart was pounding in my chest like a drum. Whoever was on the other side of that door was not here for a friendly visit, and they were growing more determined by the second. I quickly retreated to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I pulled open the drawer where I kept my basic cutlery set. I grabbed a knife, its dull edge glinting in the dim light. It was not much, but it was all I had. I felt a small surge of courage as I gripped the handle tightly. Suddenly there was a loud thud against the door. Once, twice, and then a third time. The wooden door creaked under the strain and I could hear the splintering of wood. My breath hitched in my throat. I had a solid door, but would it be enough to hold back the intruder? I darted into my bedroom, the only other room in my tiny apartment with a lock. As I closed the door behind me, I heard a deafening crack from the living room. My front door had given way. The intruder was inside. My blood ran cold. The police operator had assured me that help was on the way, but at that moment, I felt utterly alone. I pushed my bed against the door, barricading myself in as best I could. My apartment fell eerily silent. I strained my ears to catch any sound, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then the noises started. Slow, deliberate footsteps made their way through the apartment, the occasional knock against furniture. The intruder was making no effort to hide his presence. Minutes passed like hours as the footsteps got closer. I clutched the knife, my palms sweaty, praying that the police would arrive soon. My eyes were fixated on the bedroom door as I saw the doorknob turn slowly. The intruder was here. He pushed against the door, but the bed I had pushed against it held firm. I held my breath as he grunted, throwing his weight against the door. I could hear him cursing under his breath, his voice muffled through the wood. Suddenly there were sounds of sirens in the distance, growing steadily louder. Relief washed over me, tears streaming down my face. The intruder seemed to hear them, too. His attempts at the door stopped abruptly, replaced by hurried footsteps retreating from the door. I stayed in my bedroom, silent and shaking until I heard the authoritative voices of the police officers echoing through my apartment. Only then did I dare to push the bed away from the door and step out. The sight that greeted me was one of chaos. My once comfortable apartment was now a scene straight out of a horror movie. The police caught the intruder a few blocks away. He had been a serial burglar, known for his violent tendencies. The officers told me I was lucky to have reacted the way I did. That night still haunts me. The feeling of helplessness, of your safety being violated in your own home, is something you never truly forget. It's a grim reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear aren't under our beds or in our closets, but just outside our front door. I had been working the night shift at a gas station for about a year. It wasn't the best job, but it paid the bills. The station was located on the outskirts of town, a lone building surrounded by woods on one side and an empty highway on the other. Most nights were uneventful, but there was one night that still gives me the chills. It was a quiet Tuesday night. The clock showed 2 a.m., and the store was empty. I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone when I noticed a man standing outside. He was tall, with long, unkempt hair covering his face. He was standing just outside the station, staring at me. At first, I thought he was just another customer, but he just stood there, not moving, just staring. It was unnerving. Minutes turned into hours, and he was still there. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread. Around 4 a.m., he finally moved. He walked up to the door, pushed it open, and entered the store. He looked around for a bit, not saying a word. Then he picked up a candy bar from one of the shelves and walked up to the counter. I scanned the item, trying not to make eye contact. He paid in cash, and just as I thought he was going to leave, he leaned in closer and said, "You shouldn't be alone here at night. It's not safe." After the man left the store, I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling. His words were ringing in my ears. "You shouldn't be alone here at night. It's not safe." I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just some weird customer trying to spook me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. An hour later, the lights in the station started flickering. At first, I thought it was a power issue, but then The radio, which had been playing some old tunes, turned to static. I tried changing the stations, but all I got was static. Then through the static, I heard a voice, barely a whisper, "Not safe." The rest of the night was a blur. The lights kept flickering, and the voice in the radio kept repeating the same words over and over again. "Not safe." I was on edge, jumping at every little noise. When my shift finally ended at 6 a.m., I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The following night, I was back at the station for my shift. I was scared, but I needed the job. The night started off quiet, no sign of the strange man from the night before. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was all a bad dream. But then, around 2 a.m., the lights started flickering again. The radio turned to static, and the same voice echoed through the speakers. "Not safe." Just then, I heard a noise from the back of the station, like something was scratching at the back door. I hesitated but decided to check it out. As I opened the back door, I felt a cold wind hit me. I looked around but didn't see anything unusual. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw something in the corner of my eye. There, in the darkness of the woods, were two glowing eyes, staring right at me. My heart pounded in my chest as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the man from the night before, his eyes gleaming in the dark. Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands reaching out. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding his grasp. I ran back into the station, locking the door behind me. He was right outside the door, banging against it, his eerie eyes staring at me through the glass. Just as I was about to lose hope, I saw the flashing lights of a police car. A customer had seen the man lurking in the woods and had called the police. They arrested him, and only then did I learn that he was a known criminal, wanted for several crimes. That was the last night I worked the night shift. The terror of those 2 nights still haunts me. It's a chilling reminder that when the sun goes down, some horrors come to light. My friends and I, fresh out of high school, decided to go on a road trip. We planned to travel across the country, stopping at various spots along the way. The group consisted of me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Abby, and our mutual friend Ben. Our trip started off great. We explored a few small towns, camped in the wilderness, and just enjoyed being young and free. But things took a turn when we decided to stop in a small, rundown town named Sparrow Creek for the night. The town had an eerie feel to it. The buildings were old, and there weren't many people around. We checked into a motel at the edge of town and planned to leave first thing in the morning. That night, we decided to grab some food from a local diner. As we walked in, the few patrons turned to look at us, their eyes lingering a little too long. We brushed it off, attributing it to the fact that we were outsiders. While eating, we noticed 2 burly men sitting at the bar, glancing at us occasionally. They wore gruff expressions and would whisper to each other, looking our way. It made us uneasy, but we tried to ignore them. After dinner, we decided to head back to the motel. As we stepped out into the night, we noticed the same 2 men from the diner following us. At first, we thought it was a coincidence, but when we changed our route and they still followed, we knew something wasn't right. We quickened our pace, our hearts pounding in our chests. We decided to take a detour, hoping to lose the men in the narrow, winding streets. But they were still right behind us, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. Finally, we made it back to the motel, rushing inside our room and locking the door behind us. We turned off the lights, peeking out of the window. The men stood outside the motel, staring at our room. After a few tense minutes, they left. We didn't sleep much that night, too scared of what might happen. We decided to leave Sparrow Creek first thing in the morning. As dawn broke, we quickly packed our things and got into our car. Just as we were about to leave, we saw the 2 men from last night standing by a pickup truck, watching us. We sped away, not looking back. We didn't stop until we were miles away from Sparrow Creek. The rest of our trip went by without any incidents, but that night in Sparrow Creek remained etched in our memories. We were lucky to get away unscathed. It served as a chilling reminder that danger could lurk in the most unexpected places, even on a fun road trip with friends. I've always loved long drives. There's something about the open road and endless horizons that calms my mind. One summer, I decided to take a solo road trip along the coast. I had a map, my car, and plenty of time. About 3 days into the trip, I was driving on a secluded highway, the ocean on one side and vast open fields on the other. It was peaceful until I noticed a figure on the side of the road. As I got closer, I saw it was a man, thumb outstretched, looking for a ride. He was middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and worn-out clothes. There was something about him that gave me pause. Maybe it was the desperation in his eyes or his odd smile, but something felt off. Despite my better judgment, I decided to offer him a ride. He climbed into the passenger seat, thanking me profusely. He told me his name was Eddie, and that he was trying to get to the next town. We drove in silence, the only sound being the hum of the car engine. After a while, I noticed Eddie kept glancing at me, his smile never leaving his face. As the journey continued, I started to feel more and more uncomfortable. Eddie's constant staring and his unusual smile were unsettling. I decided to drop him off at a gas station ahead, telling him I was taking a different route. When we reached the gas station, I told Eddie he would have to continue his journey from here. He seemed disappointed, but he nodded, thanking me for the ride. As he climbed out of the car, he turned to me, his smile wider than before. "I'll see you around," he said, his voice sending chills down my spine. I watched him walk into the gas station before I drove off, relieved to be away from him. The rest of my trip went smoothly, and I soon forgot about Eddie. It was only when I was driving back home weeks later that I saw him again. I was driving on the same secluded highway when I saw a figure on the side of the road. My heart dropped when I saw it was Eddie, his thumb outstretched, his smile as creepy as ever. I drove past him, my heart pounding in my chest. I checked my rearview mirror, and I could still see him standing there watching me. I didn't stop driving until I was far away. The encounter with Eddie has stayed with me, a chilling reminder that not everyone we meet on the road is who they seem. I've always enjoyed hiking and being outdoors. One summer, my brother and I decided to go on a week-long hiking trip in a remote national park. We had all the necessary gear, maps of the area, and enough food to last us for our trip. Our journey started off great. The trail was challenging, but the views were worth it. We would set up camp every evening, cook our meals on the fire, and sleep under the stars. On the third night, we set up camp near a small lake. After dinner, we sat by the fire sharing stories. Suddenly, we heard a low growl coming from the darkness beyond our camp. We froze, looking at each other in alarm. We quickly grabbed our flashlights, scanning the darkness. But we didn't see anything. Thinking it might be a bear, we made noise, hoping to scare it off. The growling stopped and everything went quiet. We stayed alert, but the rest of the night passed without incident. The next morning, we woke up early and checked our surroundings. There were no signs of any large animals, so we concluded that whatever made the noise last night must have left. We packed up and continued our hike, but the unease from the previous night lingered. As we trekked deeper into the wilderness, we found fresh tracks on the trail. They were bigger than any animal we knew of in this area. We also noticed broken branches and trampled foliage, like a large animal had moved through recently. Our pace quickened, a sense of dread settling over us. We wanted to reach the next campsite before nightfall, but as the sun began to set, we realized we were lost. The trail we were following seemed to disappear. The woods around us felt unfamiliar, not like the well-marked trail we were supposed to be on. We decided to set up camp right where we were and find our way back in the morning. As we huddled around the fire, we couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Every crackle of twigs, every rustling leaf sent us on high alert. As night fell, our nerves were on edge. We barely spoke, our eyes scanning the darkness. Then we heard it again, the low growl from the night before, louder and closer. We fumbled for our flashlights, shining them into the inky blackness, but all we saw were trees and shadows. Deciding we couldn't stay there, we packed up our essentials quickly. Using the map and compass, we started moving in the direction we thought was the trail. The woods were silent except for our hurried footsteps and the distant growl that seemed to be following us. After what felt like hours, we saw the welcome sight of a marked trail. Relief washed over us, but we didn't slow down, not until we were well away from where we had camped. Exhausted and scared, we set up a makeshift camp as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. We were silent, processing the terror of the night. Once the sun was up, we hiked without stopping until we reached the park ranger station. We reported our experience, their serious faces adding to our unease. In the end, we cut our trip short, the thrill of the wilderness replaced by a chilling reminder of how quickly adventure can turn into a nightmare. We were told later that rangers found signs of a large predator, likely a mountain lion, in the area where we heard the growls. We were lucky to get out when we did. Since then, our trips to the wilderness have been marked with extra caution, because out there we're not always at the top of the food chain. Working in retail, I've had my share of weird customers. But one incident sticks out in my memory. I was working the closing shift at our local convenience store. It was a quiet Tuesday night, with only a few customers coming in. About an hour before closing, a man walked in. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and wearing a heavy winter coat, which seemed odd considering it was the middle of summer. He roamed around the aisles, not picking up anything. I kept an eye on him. His behavior was a bit unusual. After a while, he approached the counter, not with an item to purchase, but with a question. "When are you closing?" he asked, his eyes never leaving mine. I felt a chill go down my spine. There was something about the way he asked that question that felt off. But I maintained my professional demeanor and replied, "In about an hour." The man just nodded and walked out of the store, leaving me slightly uneasy. I shook off the feeling and went back to work, restocking the shelves and cleaning the counters. As the closing time neared, I saw the man's figure outside the store. He was just standing there, watching. I started to feel nervous. I had to close the store soon, and I didn't want to do that with him still around. Just then, the phone rang. It was my manager. I quickly explained the situation. He told me to lock the store's front door and wait in the back room. With my heart pounding, I did as my manager instructed. I locked the front door, turned off the lights, and went to the back room. I peered through the security camera feed, and sure enough, the man was still there, standing eerily still and looking at the store. Suddenly, he began to move. He walked up to the door, tried to open it, and then began pounding on it. I felt a surge of fear, but I kept my cool and stayed in the back room, the only barrier between me and him. He pounded a few more times and then stopped. Through the security camera feed, I watched as he stood still for a moment, then walked away, disappearing into the night. I let out a sigh of relief, my heart still racing. When I felt it was safe, I unlocked the front door and quickly finished my closing duties. I checked the security camera feed again. There was no sign of the man. As I was about to leave, my eye caught something outside the store. There, in the glow of the street lamp, was the man's coat. He had left it behind. Under any other circumstance, I might have thought he'd forgotten it, but after what had happened, it felt more like a message or a threat. I hurriedly locked up and headed straight home, glancing over my shoulder more than once. Over the next few days, I reported the incident to the local authorities, and my manager had the security footage handed over. That incident was a chilling reminder of the dangers one can face, even in the most mundane settings. The man was never identified, and I never saw him again. But every time I work a closing shift, I remember that night and the eerie encounter with the man in the winter coat. As a kid, I lived in a small town where everybody knew each other. Our house was an old Victorian, the kind that carried stories within its walls. I always felt uneasy in the house, but my parents dismissed it as an active imagination. My room was on the second floor, overlooking the backyard. From my window, I could see the old swing set, the garden my mom loved, and the edge of the forest beyond. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw something strange in the backyard. A figure stood at the edge of the woods. Even in the darkness, I could tell it was a man. He just stood there, not moving, like he was watching our house. I called my parents, but by the time they got to my room, the man was gone. Despite my parents' assurance that it was just my imagination, the image of the man at the edge of the forest stayed with me. Nights turned into weeks, and every so often I would see the figure, always at the edge of the forest, always just watching. One night I decided to confront this figure. I took my dad's old flashlight and crept out of the house. The backyard was silent, except for the sounds of the night. My heart pounded as I moved closer to the edge of the forest. When I was just a few feet away, I switched on the flashlight, aiming its beam into the darkness. For a moment I saw nothing. Then, caught in the light, I saw him. The man was real. He stood there, frozen like a deer in headlights, before he turned and disappeared into the woods. After the man disappeared into the woods, I stood there, frozen in shock. I had half expected there to be nothing, that my parents were right about it all being my imagination. But there he was, a real person. I ran back to the house and told my parents. This time they took me seriously. My dad immediately called the local sheriff, who promised to send a patrol car to check the area. For the next few days, a police car would often drive by, especially at night. But the man was never seen again. Life went back to normal, but I couldn't shake off the unease. The man had been real, and he had been watching our house. The thought kept me awake at night, a constant reminder that sometimes the things we fear aren't just in our imagination. Growing up in the city, my only escape to nature was the park near my home. Even as a teen, I often found myself there enjoying the peace. One evening, as I was taking my usual walk, I noticed something odd. The park, usually bustling with people, was strangely empty. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was due to the weather. I continued my walk, enjoying the solitude. As I approached the park's small lake, I saw a figure sitting on one of the benches. It was a man, his back to me. He seemed to be staring at the lake. I hesitated for a moment but decided to mind my own business and continued on my path. As I walked, I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling. The man at the bench seemed odd. There was something about him that made me uncomfortable. Against my better judgment, I glanced back, and to my surprise, he was now standing and watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly turned away and increased my pace. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, but I could feel his gaze on me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. They were fast, getting louder and closer. Panic washed over me. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I could hear the footsteps still following me. I sprinted out of the park and onto the main street, the sounds of traffic and people, a comforting presence. I turned to look back. The man was at the park entrance, just standing there, watching me. I could see his face now, cold, emotionless eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't waste any more time. I hurried home, always looking over my shoulder, the image of the man's face etched in my mind. The next day I reported the incident to the local police. They assured me they would increase patrols in the area. But the park, once my sanctuary, was now a place I dreaded. The man was never caught, and I never saw him again. But I'll always remember that creepy evening in the park, a reminder of the danger that can lurk in the most unexpected places. I live in a small, quiet neighborhood where everyone knows everyone. A few months ago, we decided to start a neighborhood watch. I was one of the first to volunteer, doing night shifts after my day job. One night during my patrol, I noticed a house with its front door wide open. It was Johnson's house. They were an elderly couple who kept to themselves mostly. The sight was odd, and a feeling of unease crept over me. I approached the house, calling out for Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. No answer. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Inside Johnson's house, it was eerily silent. As I moved through the living room, I called out again, but got no response. There were signs of a struggle, furniture overturned and personal items scattered around. As I made my way to the kitchen, I noticed the back door was also wide open. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Something was definitely wrong. I stepped into the backyard, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then I saw it. On the ground lay Mr. Johnson, unmoving. I rushed over to him, checking for a pulse. Nothing. I felt a lump in my throat. I immediately called the local authorities. Within minutes, they were at the house, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the otherwise peaceful neighborhood. I watched from a distance as they took Mr. Johnson away. Questions swirled in my mind. Where was Mrs. Johnson? What had happened here? As the days went by, the truth came out. Mrs. Johnson was found in the forest behind their house, scared but unharmed. It was a break-in gone wrong, the authorities said. I couldn't shake off the guilt. The neighborhood watch was supposed to prevent things like this. But we were too late. I'll never forget that night. It's a harsh reminder that even the quietest neighborhoods aren't always safe. I've always been a fan of road trips, the freedom of the open road, the excitement of new places. One summer, I decided to take a solo trip across the country. One evening, after driving for hours through vast stretches of empty land, I found myself in the middle of nowhere. The sun was setting, and I realized I should find a place to rest for the night. I saw an old motel sign flickering in the distance. The Rest Easy Motel. It was run down and seemed deserted, but it was the only place in miles. I parked my car and walked up to the front desk. The motel lobby was dusty and dimly lit. I rang the bell on the counter. An older man appeared, startling me. He had a hollow look in his eyes, but he checked me in without a word. I made my way to my room. It was small and smelled of stale air. The whole place gave me an odd feeling, but I was too tired to care. As the night grew darker, I could hear strange sounds outside my room. Soft footsteps, whispers. Each sound sent a shiver down my spine, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I decided to step out for some fresh air, hoping it would calm my nerves. Outside, the motel was silent, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. I walked around a bit, the gravel crunching under my feet. Suddenly, I heard a soft whimpering sound. It was coming from a small shed near the back of the motel. Curiosity piqued. I approached the shed. The whimpering grew louder. I pushed open the door, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. There, huddled in the corner, was a young woman. She looked terrified and was bound by ropes. I was in shock, but I knew I had to act quickly. I hurried over to the woman, reassuring her that I was there to help. I untied the ropes and helped her stand. She was weak and scared, but managed to whisper a thank you. We made our way out of the shed, and I guided her toward my car. I could see the old man from the front desk in the distance watching us. His eyes were wide with surprise, but we didn't stick around to see his reaction. With the woman safe in my car, we drove away from the Rest Easy Motel and never looked back. We found a local law enforcement office in the next town over, and they took over from there. That night at the motel, in the middle of nowhere, was the scariest experience of my life. But I'm glad I was there to help the woman escape her nightmare. I was always an early riser, so when my dog Max started barking at 5 in the morning, I didn't think much of it. I put on my shoes and prepared to take him for a walk around our quiet neighborhood, just as the sun was starting to rise. As we were strolling down the deserted streets, I noticed something strange. A man was standing at the end of the road, perfectly still, watching us. He seemed out of place, like he didn't belong. He was a tall figure, dressed in a long coat despite the summer heat. His eyes never left us as we approached. There was something unsettling about his gaze, and it put me on edge. But this was my neighborhood. I wouldn't be intimidated. "Good morning," I called out to him, forcing a smile. Max growled slightly, his fur bristling. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring, a slight smirk playing on his lips. I quickened my pace, eager to get past him and back to the safety of my house. As we moved past him, I felt a chill run down my spine. Max kept looking back, growling under his breath. Once we were a safe distance away, I glanced back. The stranger was still standing there, watching us. Feeling uneasy, I decided to cut our walk short. I hurried back home with Max, locked the doors, and peered out the window. The man was gone. I spent the rest of the day on edge. Every noise made me jump, and every shadow seemed menacing. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I found it hard to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's cold, piercing gaze. Max seemed restless too, pacing around my room and whining. Suddenly, a noise from the living room jolted me awake. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, as Max started barking wildly. Slowly, I crept out of my room and down the hall. I could see a figure through the dim light, the same tall man from this morning, rummaging through my living room. His back was towards me, giving me a chance to retreat. Fear surged through me, but I knew I had to act. I tiptoed back to my room, Max following close behind. I picked up my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the local security firm's number. I whispered into the phone, explaining the situation. As I ended the call, I peeked out of my room. The man was now standing still, facing the hallway where I was hiding. It was as though he knew I was watching him. I retreated into my room, pushing a dresser in front of the door. Max was growling again, his eyes never leaving the door. I could hear the man walking towards my room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Max's growls turned into snarls, his body stiff and ready to pounce. I clutched my phone, praying for the security firm to get here soon. The man stopped outside my door. I could see his shadow under the door, tall and ominous. I could hear him breathing. It felt like he was taunting me, reveling in my fear. I hugged Max close, his body trembling under my hands. Suddenly a loud noise came from outside. Blue and red lights flashed through the window. The local security firm had arrived. I heard the man growl in frustration, and then the sound of retreating footsteps. A few moments later, there was a knock on my door. "Security," a voice called out. With a mixture of relief and trepidation, I cautiously opened the door to find two security officers standing outside. They quickly assessed the situation and assured me that they would conduct a thorough search of the area. While they combed through the house and surrounding area, I recounted what had happened earlier that day, from the unsettling encounter in the morning to the strange man breaking in at night. The security officers returned after what felt like an eternity. They explained that they couldn't find any trace of the man, but they would increase patrols in the neighborhood and keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and sound made me jump, convinced the man had returned. Max stayed by my side, sensing my unease. In the following days, the neighborhood seemed quieter than ever. The security firm kept its promise and increased patrols, providing a sense of reassurance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I decided to be more cautious. I installed security cameras around my house and kept all doors and windows locked at all times. Max became my constant companion, alert and watchful. One evening, as I was returning from work, I noticed a piece of paper stuck to my front door. It was a note, written in a chilling scrawl. "I see you." Panic gripped me as I looked around, but there was no one in sight. Fear consumed me as I quickly stepped inside and locked the door behind me. I called the security firm to report the incident, and they assured me they would investigate further. But deep down, I knew that this relentless stalker would not be easy to catch. Over the next few days, the notes kept coming. Each one was more disturbing than the last. "I know where you sleep. You can't hide from me." The stranger seemed to know every detail of my life, and it sent chills down my spine. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that the man was always watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Despite my fear, I refused to be a prisoner in my own home. I reached out to the local police, providing them with all the evidence, the notes, the encounter, and even the security camera footage. The police launched a full investigation, but the stranger remained elusive. They set up additional patrols in the area, but every time I received a note, it felt like he was one step ahead of them. I confided in my close friends and family about the terrifying ordeal, and they offered their support. They encouraged me to stay strong and assured me that the authorities would eventually catch this deranged stalker. As the days turned into weeks, the notes became less frequent. I hoped it meant the stranger had given up, but deep down, I knew he was still out there, watching and waiting. Just when I thought the nightmare might be over, the stranger's sinister presence returned with a vengeance. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a tapping noise coming from my bedroom window. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned toward the source of the sound. There, in the dim moonlight, was a chilling sight. The man, the same stranger I had encountered weeks ago, was standing outside my window, staring at me with those cold, menacing eyes. He held up another note against the glass, and I could see the words, "You can't escape me," written in blood-red ink. Terror consumed me, and I immediately called the police. But by the time they arrived, the man had vanished into the darkness once again, leaving behind only the haunting echoes of his presence. The police intensified their efforts, setting up surveillance teams and tracking any leads they could find. But the stranger seemed to be a master at eluding capture. He left no fingerprints, no traces, just a haunting sense of dread wherever he went. My life had become a nightmare. I constantly felt his malevolent gaze on me, even when I was alone in the safety of my own home. The notes kept coming, each one more sinister than the last, taunting me with the knowledge that he was always one step ahead. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump with terror. The man had invaded my life, my thoughts, my very existence. One night, as I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, I heard a faint sound outside my bedroom window. I mustered the courage to look, and there he was again, his haunting eyes locked onto mine. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and called the police. The operator assured me that help was on the way and to stay on the line until the police arrived. I watched the man outside my window, his lips curling into a sinister grin. He knew he had me trapped, and there was no escape from the terror he had unleashed upon my life. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air, and the man's grin faded. He quickly vanished into the shadows, disappearing as if he was never there. The police arrived moments later, but the man had vanished without a trace. The police searched the area, but once again, the man seemed to have vanished into thin air. They assured me that they would keep a close eye on my neighborhood, and that I should reach out if anything suspicious happened. Despite their reassurances, the fear continued to gnaw at me. I installed additional security measures around my home, desperate to protect myself from the relentless stalker. Weeks passed, and there were no signs of the stranger. I began to let my guard down, hoping that he had finally given up. But just as I started to feel a sense of normalcy, the nightmare returned. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I saw him. The man was standing across the street watching me with that same malevolent gaze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly drove away, not daring to look back. I knew I couldn't go on living in fear. It was time to take matters into my own hands. I reached out to a private investigator, hoping that their expertise could finally put an end to this nightmare. The investigator conducted a thorough background check and managed to uncover a few leads. But the man seemed to be a master of deception, leaving behind false trails to throw us off his scent. I became consumed with finding him, determined to reclaim my life from this relentless tormentor. Sleepless nights turned into tireless days as I worked with the investigator to track down any piece of information that could lead us to the man's identity. Finally, after weeks of tireless pursuit, we made a breakthrough. The investigator managed to trace the man's phone calls to a remote cabin in the woods, far from civilization. Armed with this newfound information, I mustered the courage to confront the man and put an end to the nightmare that had haunted me for so long. With the police by my side, we ventured into the depths of the woods, following the trail that the investigator had uncovered. The air was thick with tension as we approached the remote cabin. As we got closer, the feeling of being watched intensified. I could sense that the man knew we were coming, and a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. With guns drawn, we cautiously approached the cabin. The police called out for the man to surrender, but there was no response. The silence was deafening, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. As we entered the cabin, a wave of fear washed over me. The place was filled with an eerie silence, and a cold draft sent shivers down my spine. The police carefully searched every room, but there was no sign of the man. Just when we thought he might have escaped, we heard a faint noise coming from the basement. The police rushed down the stairs with me close behind. In the dimly lit basement, we found him. The man crouched in a corner like a wounded animal. His eyes were wide with fear, and he muttered incomprehensible words. It was then that I realized the truth. The man wasn't a sinister stalker, but a victim of his own mind. He was suffering from severe mental illness, and his actions were driven by delusions beyond his control. My heart sank as I looked at the man in front of me. All this time, I'd been terrified of him, but now I saw him as someone in desperate need of help. The police quickly apprehended him, and he was taken into custody. I insisted that he be treated with compassion and provided with the necessary mental health care. In the weeks that followed, I learned more about the man's background. He had suffered from a severe mental illness for years, which had gone untreated due to a lack of resources and support. He had become fixated on me, believing that I was the key to curing his torment. It was a sobering revelation. I had been living in constant fear of a man who was suffering from a reality far more terrifying than anything I could imagine. As the truth unfolded, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. I felt sympathy for the man's struggle with mental illness, but I also couldn't forget the terror he had inflicted on my life. The police ensured that the man received the proper mental health treatment he needed. I was grateful for that, but the scars of the experience still lingered. With time, I slowly started to rebuild my life. I moved to a new neighborhood, far away from the memories that haunted me. I attended therapy to help me cope with the trauma I had endured. The ordeal had taught me to be more vigilant about my safety, but it had also made me appreciate the simple moments of peace and security in life. I tried my best to find solace in the present and not let the fear of the past consume me. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. The memories of that terrifying stranger encounter still haunted me, but I was learning to manage the fear and anxiety that lingered. One evening, as I was taking Max for a walk in my new neighborhood, I noticed a woman sitting alone on a park bench. She seemed lost in thought, and something about her demeanor struck a chord with me. Approaching cautiously, I introduced myself and struck up a conversation. Her name was Sarah, and she had recently moved to the area. As we talked, I sensed a sadness in her eyes, a hidden pain that mirrored my own. As Sarah and I continued to talk, we discovered that we had both experienced hardships and trauma in our pasts. Our shared experiences created an instant bond, and we soon became close friends. Through our friendship, we found solace and understanding in each other's company. We supported each other through the difficult days, offering a safe space to share our fears and vulnerabilities. As time passed, I realized that healing wasn't just about moving on from the past, but also about embracing the present and the people who came into my life. Sarah had become an anchor, a reminder that there was still goodness and kindness in the world. We embarked on new adventures together, exploring the beauty of the world while cherishing the moments of peace we found in each other's company. Though the memories of the stranger encounter lingered, they no longer controlled me. As Sarah and I continued to lean on each other, we discovered the power of resilience and friendship. We found strength in knowing that we weren't alone in our struggles and that we could support each other through the darkest of times. With each passing day, the memories of the terrifying stranger encounter began to fade. The fear that had once gripped me slowly gave way to a newfound sense of empowerment and determination to live life to the fullest. Together, Sarah and I created new memories, forging a bond that went beyond the horrors of our pasts. We realized that while we couldn't erase the scars of the past, we could choose to rise above them and embrace the beauty of the present. Life went on, and our friendship blossomed into something truly special. We became each other's strength and support, reminding ourselves of the resilience we had discovered within ourselves. I had always been a bit of a loner, my quiet demeanor lending itself to a life of solitude. That is, until I met Emily. Emily was beautiful, vibrant, and full of life. She had this uncanny ability to light up a room just by being in it. We connected instantly and started dating. A few months into our relationship, she invited me to meet her family. Excited, I accepted the invitation, unaware of the horror that awaited me. Emily's family lived in a grand old house, nestled away on the outskirts of town. It was a beautiful yet intimidating structure, covered in crawling ivy and surrounded by a gloomy forest. The moment I stepped foot inside, I felt an unsettling chill, but I dismissed it as nerves. Emily's family was exceedingly welcoming. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wright, were jovial, and her younger siblings were as lively as Emily. Yet there was a strange air about the house, a certain uneasiness that I couldn't put my finger on. As the evening unfolded, we sat down for dinner. The table was heaving under the weight of a lavish spread. The centerpiece was a large meat dish, unlike anything I had ever seen. The meat was succulent and delicious, albeit a bit strange in texture and flavor. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to use the restroom. On my way back, I stumbled upon a slightly ajar door leading to the basement. A strange metallic smell wafted out from the basement, piquing my curiosity. The sight that met my eyes in the dimly lit basement is one I'll never forget. There were hooks hanging from the ceiling, each carrying human-sized shapes wrapped in butcher paper. There were tools that looked too much like instruments of torture. A cold realization dawned upon me as the smell hit me again, stronger this time. I stumbled back, nausea rising in my throat. The meat. The strange dish. I could hardly contain my horror. It all made sense now. The remote house, the strange air about the family, and the unidentifiable meat. Barely holding it together, I returned to the dining room. Emily was looking at me with a strange smile on her face. The family was watching me, their eyes gleaming with an eerie glow. I made an excuse about feeling unwell and dashed out of the house, the haunting image of the basement still burning in my eyes. I broke up with Emily soon after, not daring to reveal the true reason. Every night, I am haunted by nightmares of Emily and her family. The laughter, the feast, the strange meat, and the chilling discovery, all are constant reminders of the horrifying reality I escaped. The image of the beautiful girl who belonged to a family of cannibals has scarred me, turning my life into a waking nightmare. The experience has left me deeply mistrustful, forever wary of the horrors that lurk beneath the surface of normalcy. As a child, I was the star of a popular children's show, Charlie's Adventure World. I, Charlie, was the plucky, fun-loving host who embarked on wild adventures, teaching kids about life, friendship, and the joy of discovery. One day, at the height of its third season, the show abruptly stopped airing. The viewers, my loyal fans, were left in confusion, and the rumors began to circulate. What had happened to Charlie? Years later, now a film student, I've often found myself looking back at my early fame and the mysterious end of my show. I decided to make it the subject of my final year project, hoping to finally lay to rest the rumors and my own nagging questions. My investigation led me to my former producer, Mr. Peterson. His countenance changed when I mentioned the show, his usual cheeriness replaced with a solemn look. He handed me an old, dusty VHS tape. "The last episode we filmed," he said quietly. The fear in his voice unnerved me. At home, I cautiously played the tape. The episode started as usual, but I immediately noticed the tension replacing our usual cheer. I was visibly distracted, a shadow of my usual on-screen character. Suddenly, strange occurrences began to unfold. Props moved on their own. Lights flickered. A spine-chilling voice echoed across the set. I saw myself on screen, genuine fear replacing the scripted reactions. Then, the camera focused on a mirror, a prop I didn't remember. In its reflection was a shadowy, inhuman figure. The episode cut off abruptly just as my younger self turned to face the mirror. The chilling memory of that day flooded back. Something had been on that set, something truly terrifying. It had been enough to end my career prematurely and silence everyone involved with the show. As I unveiled my project, the unaired episode, public fascination grew. My childhood secret was out, revealing the haunting reality that led to the abrupt end of Charlie's Adventure World. The real question remains unanswered. What was the entity that had invaded our set that fateful day? Sometimes, when I glance at my reflection, I half expect to see that shadowy figure looming behind me, a chilling reminder of my own untold story. Maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. Ever since I moved into my new apartment, my computer screen started flickering at exactly midnight. I initially dismissed it as a wiring issue, or perhaps a bug, but one night, things took a turn. As the clock struck midnight, my screen flickered, but this time, an unrecognizable silhouette appeared. It was a man, I think, staring right at me. I thought it was a prank by my friends, so I laughed it off. But then, the figure began to speak. "Can you see me?" The words came on my screen, typed in a font I'd never seen before. I was startled, yet I responded, assuming it was a joke. But as the nights passed, our conversations got deeper and darker. He started knowing things he shouldn't, things I'd never shared. One night he typed, "Did you enjoy the tea your mother made when you were 11? That was the year my mother died." This was no longer amusing. I disconnected my computer, but the silhouette remained, staring. It wasn't a live stream, it was something else, something otherworldly. It saw me, it knew me, and it was inside my computer. During the late 1800s, nestled between forgotten valleys, lay a quaint little town by the name of Dunwich. Despite its peaceful facade, this forgotten town held a dark, clandestine secret. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the eerie occurrences that seemed to haunt their days and invade their nights. Yet they refused to abandon their homes, their roots tying them to the forsaken land like a curse. It was the late summer of 1889 when Jonathan, an ambitious journalist from Boston, decided to venture into Dunwich. The enigmatic tales of the town, whispered in the hallowed halls of journalism, had sparked his curiosity. Armed with his pen, paper, and an unquenchable thirst for truth, he made his way to Dunwich. Upon arriving, he found the town unnaturally silent, the emptiness of its streets filled with an air of eerie anticipation. The houses were well preserved, mirroring the architecture of decades past. Yet they stood vacant, empty as if life had fled from their darkened windows. Jonathan's heart pounded against his chest as he walked through the deserted lanes, his only company being his echoing footsteps. The only sign of life in the desolate town was the ever-present glow from the local inn, the Hanged Man. He decided to make it his base, hoping to learn about the town's history from its residents. The innkeeper, a haggard old woman named Abigail, welcomed him with a sly, knowing smile that sent a chill down his spine. Over the following days, Jonathan tried to gather information about the town. He came across tales of the town's original settlers, who, according to local folklore, had made a pact with a malevolent entity that lived in the surrounding woods, promising it a tribute every decade for their safety and prosperity. However, these agreements were not without consequences. Each tribute was to be a human, preferably a child, whose innocent spirit was said to please the entity. The selected were always the most recent newcomers, taken in the dead of night on the eve of a new decade. Jonathan, naturally a man of science and logic, scoffed at these fantastical tales, yet he noticed the town's children were sparse, and every local carried a burden of sadness in their eyes. Unbeknownst to him, his arrival coincided with the end of a decade, and the town's agreement with the entity was due. One night, while Jonathan was engrossed in his notes, he heard a child sobbing outside. Guided by the eerie cries, he ventured into the darkened streets. His lantern's feeble light flickered, casting monstrous shadows on the cobbled pathways, but he persisted, following the faint sound. Finally, he reached the forest's edge. He found a small, trembling girl named Sophie, the last child to move into Dunwich. She sobbed about the shadowy figure that had been lurking in her dreams, whispering promises of eternal darkness. Shaken by her fear and the chilling tale, Jonathan promised to protect her, the logic-driven journalist now swayed by the palpable fear in the child's eyes. In the following days, Jonathan prepared himself for the fateful night. He didn't know what to expect but felt a newfound courage, fueled by the determination to save Sophie. He researched protective charms and wards from local lore and armed himself with an ancient symbol believed to ward off the malevolent entity. The eve of the decade arrived, a night of such potent darkness that even the stars seemed to have deserted the sky. The whole town was engulfed in silence, save for the deafening pounding of Jonathan's heart. He stood guard outside Sophie's house, the protective symbol etched on the door, his gaze scanning the ominous woods. As midnight approached, a gut-wrenching howl echoed from the depths of the forest, and a chilling wind swept through the town. The entity had come. Out of the shadows emerged a figure, a horrific blend of man and beast, its eyes burning with a hunger that threatened to devour all life. Its gaze fell upon Jonathan, who stood firm, the protective symbol shining brightly in his hand. The entity roared, its monstrous sound shaking the very foundations of Dunwich. Jonathan fought back his fear and raised the symbol, its light piercing the darkness. The entity recoiled, its roars turning into guttural cries. The battle raged on through the night, a man of science against an entity of ancient darkness. As dawn approached, the entity, weakened by the protective symbol and Jonathan's unyielding determination, retreated into the forest. Its defeated roars faded into the distance, replaced by the soft light of dawn. The town of Dunwich was silent no more. It buzzed with the sounds of life, a stark contrast to the eerie silence Jonathan had encountered upon his arrival. He had defeated the entity, saved Sophie, and broken the cursed pact. The town of Dunwich began to thrive again, and the tales of horror were replaced by those of Jonathan's bravery. Years later, as an old man, Jonathan penned down the last lines of his story. Despite his triumph, he could never forget the horrors he had witnessed. The man of logic and reason had come to understand the existence of things beyond his comprehension. His tale of Dunwich became a beacon, a warning to those who dared to dismiss the ancient legends, and an eternal reminder of the cursed town of Dunwich. And so, Dunwich remained, a symbol of a battle fought and won, standing against the test of time, its silence no longer eerie but hopeful. As for the entity, it lurked in the depths of the forgotten forest. Its reign of terror ended, forever banished to the shadows by a man who dared to defy it. The rhythmic tapping of rain against the window pane, the distant rumble of thunder, and the flickering lamplight set the stage as I found myself scrolling through online forums, sifting through the monotony of everyday life for something interesting. There it was, a thread titled, "The Last Man Standing, a Game You Won't Forget." Intrigued, I clicked. The post was an invitation, a call to all thrill seekers, claiming to provide an unmatched experience of adrenaline and horror. A downloadable link was provided, along with a stern warning: sign the rule sheet before you play, for your own safety. An eerie sense of unease crept in, yet curiosity got the better of me. I downloaded the game, the ominous warning echoing in my mind. The installation process was swift and without incident, and soon I was staring at a stark digital rule sheet with a place for my signature at the bottom. The rules were peculiar. Play alone and in the dark. Do not pause the game. Do not look away from the screen. Do not, under any circumstances, let anyone else into the room. You may stop playing anytime, but remember Rule 2, survive. With a nervous chuckle, I signed the digital form, rationalizing it as nothing more than a clever way to heighten the immersion. I clicked Start Game and watched my screen flicker, unsettling digital laughter echoing from the speakers as the game began. It was a simple first-person game, with your character trapped in a decrepit mansion filled with unidentifiable shadows and shifting disembodied whispers. The objective was to survive the night. No weapons, no companions, just a ticking clock and a single directive: survive. As I maneuvered through the mansion, a creeping sense of unease made itself known. The game's ambiance was unnervingly realistic. The chilling whispers, the sudden movements in the periphery of the game, the feeling of being watched. It was as if the game was reaching beyond the screen, its cold fingers brushing against my reality. An hour in, and things took a darker turn. The whispers grew louder, turning into threatening growls, the shadows more aggressive. The line between the game and reality blurred as my room chilled, the whispers now audible without the speakers. The sense of dread was overwhelming, but I remembered Rule 2. Do not pause the game. A chilling laugh filled my room, and I turned back to the screen to see a grotesque figure lunging at me. A scream escaped my lips as the screen went black, the words "You died" emblazoned in blood red. Then silence. Relieved it was over, I reached to shut down the system, but then the game relaunched itself. The same grotesque figure now roamed the mansion. The objective wasn't survival anymore, it was run. The room around me seemed to warp, shadows creeping along the walls, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. As I made my character run, the figure pursued relentlessly, its grotesque laughter reverberating through the mansion and my room. In a desperate attempt, I tried to force shut the system. As soon as my hand touched the power button, an electric shock surged through me, throwing me back. The figure on the screen laughed, the words "no cheating" flashing on the screen. The game had me in its vice-like grip, my reality succumbing to the terror it fed on. The room was freezing now, the shadows on the wall twisting into grotesque figures, the laughter of the digital monstrosity my only companion. My desperate cries for help were drowned by its incessant laughter. Hours turned into days, the game continuing its relentless pursuit of horror, the line between the game and my reality almost non-existent. The game was my reality, and I was a character trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear. Every time the monster caught me, I would feel a cold, crushing grip around my heart, my scream echoing in sync with my character. Each time I respawned, the mansion was more horrifying, the monster more terrifying, In the silence of my room, in the dark, I found myself a prisoner to the game. The shadows danced around me, the whispers continued, and the laughter never ceased. I played, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. I write this account as a warning to anyone tempted by the call of the last man standing. I am a prisoner in my own home, my existence reduced to this horrifying game. Each breath I take echoes the chilling laughter of the digital monster, each heartbeat a ticking clock toward my next death in the game. Should you come across the game, remember my tale. The thrill is not worth the horror that follows. The rule sheet is not just a gimmick. The game is a trap, a digital prison you willingly enter, lured by the promise of a thrill. The game continues, my tired fingers maneuvering through the mansion's dark corridors. The monster lurks around the corner, its laughter ringing in my ears. This is my existence now, a never-ending game of cat and mouse, a prisoner of my curiosity, the last man standing. Ever since childhood, my small town of Otter Creek, Idaho, had been a quiet and peaceful sanctuary, a world untouched by the pace of city life. Surrounded by sprawling wheat fields and shadowy mountains, it was a place where everyone knew everyone, and a stranger was as rare as a blue moon. Until that night. The night that scarred us, the night that the government came, the night they shot something out of the sky and refused to tell us why. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening, and the sun was setting behind the jagged silhouette of the mountains, staining the sky with hues of crimson and purple. I was sitting on my porch, nursing a bottle of beer, eyes half closed in the dying warmth of the day. Suddenly, a loud booming sound echoed across the sky, so intense it rattled the windows in their frames. I jolted upright, scanning the heavens. There, streaking across the canvas of the setting sun, was a strange object, on fire, a trail of smoke behind it. My heart pounded as it crashed into the outskirts of town, the impact so strong it felt like an earthquake. The tranquility of the evening was shattered, replaced by a symphony of car alarms and the panicked barking of dogs. Neighbors stumbled out of their homes, fear painted on their faces. But the night was just beginning. Within an hour, the town was swarming with government vehicles. Men and women in black uniforms flooded the streets, their faces obscured by gas masks and night vision goggles. They cordoned off the crash site, their grim faces bathed in the eerie glow of the flames, reflecting off the visors of their helmets. No one was allowed near it, and all attempts to question them were met with silence. All we were told was to stay indoors, and that everything was under control. But the fear in their eyes told a different story. The night turned into day, then back into the night, yet the government's presence only increased. Black helicopters patrolled the skies while armored vehicles prowled the streets. Our quiet town had turned into a militarized zone overnight. The unease was palpable, the tension, a ticking time bomb. But the true horror was yet to come. It was around midnight when the screams started. At first, they were distant, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But as the night progressed, they grew louder and more horrifying. They were unlike anything I had ever heard, a guttural, animalistic cacophony of terror that echoed through the empty streets. People started to go missing. First, it was old Mrs. Baker from across the street. Then it was the local butcher, then the town sheriff. Homes were found deserted, meals half-eaten, TVs still playing, as if the occupants had vanished into thin air. Despite the mounting terror, the government remained silent. Their soldiers patrolled the streets, their faces devoid of any emotion, their guns at the ready. It felt as though we were under siege, not from an external enemy, but from our very own protectors. One night, unable to stand the fear and isolation, I decided to find out what was happening. I crept out under the cover of darkness, avoiding the patrolling soldiers, and made my way toward the crash site. What I saw there would haunt me forever. The site was illuminated by harsh floodlights, casting long, twisted shadows. In the center of the chaos was the object they had shot down. It was a spacecraft, unlike any design I had ever seen, with sleek silver lines and pulsating luminescent lights. But it wasn't the ship that chilled my blood. Around the site were bodies, human bodies, twisted and contorted in their final moments of terror. And among them, standing tall, were otherworldly beings, their skin glowing in the harsh light, their eyes devoid of any discernible emotion. They were cleaning up, disposing of the bodies, erasing any evidence of their existence. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The screams, the missing people, the government's silence. It all made sense. We were not alone, and our protectors had known all along. We were just collateral damage, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. I snuck back home, and the images seared into my mind. I locked my doors, shut my windows, and sank to the floor, trembling. The government had shot something down over my town and refused to tell us why. Now I knew. They hadn't come to protect us. They had come to contain us, to hide the horrifying truth. That night changed everything. We were no longer just residents of a small, insignificant town. We were witnesses to cosmic horror, puppets in a terrifying game played by beings beyond our understanding. Our lives would never be the same again, and the silence of the government echoed louder than any confession. They knew, and they had always known. My name's Jack, and I'm an ordinary guy. You know, the type who works 9 to 5, pays his bills, and looks for the cheapest deals online to save a buck or two. Craigslist had always been a goldmine for me, helping me find everything from my car to my cat. One day, I saw an ad titled, "Antique Grandfather Clock Free If You Can Haul It." The attached photos showed a massive, ornate clock that looked straight out of a 19th century mansion. It was a beauty. The post said the owner was moving and couldn't take it with them. The clock was in a grand old house nestled on the outskirts of town. I met with the seller, an elderly lady named Mrs. Baxter. She seemed relieved that someone was willing to take the clock off her hands. As I and my buddy Mike struggled to move the heavy clock, Mrs. Baxter watched silently from the porch, her frail hands clenching her shawl tightly. Once the clock was set up in my living room, it became the room's centerpiece. However, something about it was off. I noticed that the clock always struck 13 times at midnight. I laughed it off as a mechanical issue, but then things got weirder. I'd find the hands of the clock spinning wildly at times, or the pendulum swinging hard enough to shake the entire clock. The eeriest was when I'd hear the soft, ghostly ticking of the clock in the dead of night, even when I had removed its batteries. Nights became restless. The ticking turned into a metronome in my dreams, making me toss and turn. I'd wake up to the feeling of being watched, only to find the silent silhouette of the clock looming in the darkness. A sense of unease began to creep into my life. Mike suggested we look into the clock's history. After some digging, we found that it was crafted by a clockmaker in the late 1800s who had gone mad, claiming his clocks were alive. His most significant creation was said to be a large grandfather clock. Our clock. The clock's erratic behavior grew worse. I'd find it in different parts of my home. The chime would ring out at odd hours, and I'd hear hushed whispers echoing from its wooden body. Even my cat steered clear of the clock, hissing whenever she got near it. I decided to take the clock back to Mrs. Baxter. She confessed that she'd experienced similar incidents. She was too afraid to dispose of it herself, fearing the wrath of the clockmaker's spirit. With the help of a local priest, we performed a blessing ceremony on the clock. As the final prayers were said, the clock chimed loudly, and then silence. The ticking stopped. The pendulum was still. The aura around the clock felt lighter, almost peaceful. We left the clock at Mrs. Baxter's house, thanking her for the adventure we hadn't bargained for. Back at my home, life returned to normal. The eerie feeling was gone, and sleep came easily. Since then, I've been more cautious about my Craigslist finds. Every deal has a price, and sometimes it's not in dollars and cents. My name's Jack. I'm a truck driver, usually hauling loads across the country. I've always loved the solitude and the peace of night driving. One night, my perspective on the open road and the enveloping darkness changed forever. I was on a long-haul route from New York to Colorado. It was around midnight, and I was on a deserted highway slicing through the heartland. The cab's radio was my only company, spitting out late-night talk shows and old rock songs. Suddenly, my truck's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I jerked the wheel, the truck swerving wildly as I tried not to hit the person. When the truck came to a halt, I looked back but saw no one on the road. Shaken, I decided to get some sleep at the next rest stop. An hour later, I pulled into a nearly deserted rest stop. As I parked the truck, I saw the same person from the road standing by the restroom building, barely within the range of the flickering streetlight. They wore a hood, obscuring their face. I approached them, asking if they were okay. They didn't reply, only pointed down the road, back the way I came. Feeling a chill creep up my spine, I decided to retreat to the safety of my truck. Once inside, I looked back toward the restrooms. The hooded person was now standing at my window. I yelped, heart pounding as they pulled back their hood, revealing a woman's face, pale and eyes wide with terror. "Don't go down that road," she whispered, then vanished into the night. Taking the woman's advice to heart, I decided to take a longer alternate route. As I drove along the new route, the radio reported a massive landslide on the highway I was initially on, occurring just after I'd left the rest stop. The accident would have likely claimed my life if I hadn't changed my course. The news sent shivers down my spine. I remembered the woman at the rest stop, her urgent warning. It was as if she'd known about the danger. Was she a guardian angel? Or was she something else entirely? I arrived in Colorado safely, but the strange incident stuck with me. Since that night, I've learned to trust my instincts and pay attention to the signs around me, no matter how weird or supernatural they may seem. The open road at night now held a different meaning, a world where the unexplained and reality intertwined. When I first arrived at Blackwood Manor, it seemed like a dream come true. An old sprawling mansion surrounded by thick woods. It had been left to me by a distant relative. The place was run down and had been uninhabited for years, but I saw it as a chance to start fresh. Upon moving in, I soon began to realize that Blackwood Manor was not as it seemed. The house creaked and groaned. Strange noises echoed through the halls, and I could swear I felt a chill in the air, even during the warmest days. As I started to explore the manor, I came across an old diary hidden in the attic. It belonged to a girl named Emily, who had lived in the house over a century ago. The diary was filled with her thoughts, dreams, and fears. It became evident that Emily had met a tragic end within these walls. The more I read, the more I felt her presence. I would hear soft footsteps, feel a cold breeze when no windows were open, and even catch glimpses of a shadowy figure determined to uncover the truth. I began to delve into the history of Blackwood Manor. I discovered that Emily had been accused of witchcraft by the local villagers and was locked in her room by her own family. There, she starved to death, her cries for help going unanswered. I began to have dreams, vivid and terrifying, where Emily would appear, pleading for her story to be told. Her soul was trapped in Blackwood Manor, seeking justice and yearning to be set free. I decided to seek the help of a local medium who confirmed that Emily's spirit was indeed haunting the manor. Together, we performed a ritual, aiming to help Emily find peace. The night of the ritual was stormy, the wind howling outside. We set up candles and began to chant, calling upon Emily's spirit. The house seemed to come alive, the walls shaking, and a voice whispering through the air. Emily's ghost appeared, her figure translucent and eyes filled with sadness. She thanked me and told me her story, her voice a mere whisper. Her spirit had been bound to the house by her own family, a punishment for her supposed sins. With the guidance of the medium, we were able to break the curse that bound Emily to Blackwood Manor. We held a proper burial for her remains, which we found hidden within the house, and said our goodbyes. That night, the house was calm for the first time since I had arrived. Emily's spirit was finally at peace. In the following months, I restored Blackwood Manor to its former glory, always remembering the young girl who had once called it home. The haunting of Emily was over, but her memory lived on, a reminder of the dark history that had unfolded within these walls. The manor no longer felt cold and empty, but warm and filled with life. Emily's presence lingered, not as a haunting ghost, but as a friendly, watchful spirit. She was finally home, and so was I. I've lived in our sleepy little town of Aldershot all my life. Life here has always been simple and uneventful, revolving around seasonal changes and community fairs. That was until my friends and I found an old diary hidden in my attic, a diary filled with unspeakable horrors and crimes that I couldn't remember committing. It was on a lazy summer afternoon when we discovered it. My friends Jess, Rob, and I were rummaging through the attic, the air heavy with dust and forgotten memories. Hidden behind a pile of old furniture and boxes filled with long-forgotten mementos, we found a small wooden chest. Inside, beneath layers of old papers and trinkets, lay a small, worn-out diary, its leather cover cracked and faded. The diary was filled with entries written in a spidery, frantic hand. As we pored over the pages, our laughter gave way to uneasy silence. The diary contained detailed accounts of horrific deeds, each one more dreadful than the last. What froze my blood was the signature at the end of each entry, my name. The entries started with small acts of cruelty, like torturing small animals and setting a local homeless man's tent on fire, escalating to more horrifying acts. There were descriptions of people being stalked, homes being broken into, and worst of all, murders described in terrifyingly meticulous detail. But I couldn't remember any of it, not even the slightest recollection. Was it possible I had committed these heinous acts and then somehow forgotten them? Was I leading a dual life, one a small-town resident, the other a monster that lurked in the darkness? I felt sick, the pages blurring as I wrestled with my mind. As days turned into weeks, I found myself trapped in this terrifying mystery. I'd spend hours staring at the mirror, searching my own eyes for any signs of the monster that might be lurking within. I was losing sleep, tormented by nightmares of the gruesome acts depicted in the diary. One day, driven by a mix of dread and curiosity, I decided to visit one of the locations mentioned in the diary, the old Henderson barn, the supposed site of one of the murders. As I walked into the barn, a chill ran down my spine. The setting was exactly as described in the diary, but still, I couldn't remember a thing. I was terrified. I didn't know who to confide in. If the diary was to be believed, I was a monster, a threat to my friends, my family, and myself. In a desperate attempt to find answers, I decided to visit a psychiatrist, Dr. Anderson. After several sessions of hypnosis and therapy, he revealed a chilling fact. I was suffering from dissociative identity disorder. I had an alter ego, one that came to life when I was asleep, committing acts so heinous that my conscious mind had repressed the memories. As horrifying as the revelation was, it also brought a strange sense of relief. I was not a monster. I was sick. I needed help. Dr. Anderson assured me that with treatment, we could suppress the violent alter ego. But the knowledge of the atrocities that I had committed, albeit unknowingly, still gnawed at me. The diary remained a constant reminder of the other me, the horrifying alter ego that could take over at any moment. Even with the best of treatments, I lived in constant fear, haunted by the entries in that diary. Today I stand at the crossroads, battling the monster within me. The diary no longer hides in the attic. It sits on my bedside table, a constant reminder of my horrifying past and my ongoing struggle. It's a testament to the darkness that lurks within the human mind, the horrors it's capable of when left unchecked. The diary of forgotten horrors changed everything, forcing me to question my existence and humanity. Every entry, every word, every moment of dread is a part of me, a part of my life that I can't remember living but will forever haunt me. The most frightening monsters, it seems, lurk not in the dark corners of the world, but within the dark corners of our own minds. Ever since I was a kid, I'd always been a night owl, drawn to the calm and tranquility that came with the fall of darkness. When I lost my job as a bartender, it seemed only natural that I looked for a job that would keep me in my beloved night. That's when I found an opening for a security guard position at a local warehouse. The job seemed straightforward enough. Watch over the property, keep intruders out, read the job description. The pay was decent, and the hours fit my preferred schedule perfectly. It seemed like a match made in heaven. But then I received the list, the strange rules that I had to follow during my shift. Never turn off the security room lights. If the radio starts playing static at exactly 2:17 a.m., immediately switch it to FM 93.1 until the static stops. If you see a man in a red hoodie on the security cameras, immediately look away and count to 15. Do not seek him out. If the warehouse phone rings, answer on the third ring. If it's a woman asking for Timothy, hang up immediately. Between 3:30 a.m. and 4:15 a.m., Stay in the security room and do not look at the cameras. If you hear a child laughing, leave the building until it stops. The list unsettled me, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I convinced myself that it was some form of hazing and decided to go along with it. My first night went by without a hitch, the hours slowly ticking by. Then the radio began to hiss with static. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. Remembering the list, I quickly switched the station to FM 93.1. The static stopped, replaced by soft jazz. The week went by smoothly, the rules becoming second nature. I'd heard the child laughing once, the sound echoing eerily in the empty warehouse. Following the list, I'd stepped out until it stopped. But it was the fifth night that truly shook me. As I scanned the security cameras, my eyes were drawn to a figure in the corner of the screen. A man in a red hoodie, his face hidden in shadows. I felt a shiver run down my spine, my hand instinctively moving to switch cameras. I closed my eyes, counting to 15, my heart pounding in my chest. Once my shift ended, I was relieved to step out into the dawn's early light. But the terror of the red-hooded figure lingered in my mind. The strange rules of the job were starting to feel less like a joke and more like a lifeline. On the seventh night, the phone rang. One ring, two rings. I picked it up on the third. Hello? On the other end, a woman's voice asked, "Is Timothy there?" I hung up immediately, my hand shaking. The nights seemed to stretch into eons, the strange occurrences following the list's pattern to uncanny perfection. I began to dread the warehouse, my sanity hanging by a thread. Then came the worst night of all. I lost track of time, engrossed in a novel. It was only when I felt the temperature drop that I looked at the clock. It was 3:37 a.m., and I was still staring at the security cameras. In horror, I remembered the list. Between 3:30 a.m. and 4:15 a.m., I wasn't supposed to be looking at the cameras. Panicked, I stood up to move away, but something on the screen caught my eye. Figures were moving within the warehouse, their bodies contorted unnaturally. I watched, frozen, as they roamed aimlessly, their ghostly figures flickering in and out of view. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back. I called my boss and quit, too scared to ever step foot in that warehouse again. The rules haunt me, their memory serving as a chilling reminder of the warehouse. I wonder what could have happened if I hadn't followed them. I don't think I'll ever be able to shake off the chilling events of that security job, the dread deeply embedded in me. The night still calls to me, but I can't help but fear the dark corners, the unseen, the unknown, the unspoken horrors lurking just out of sight. As a UFO investigator, I've encountered my fair share of strange tales, but nothing prepared me for the chilling events in Rosendale, a small Midwestern town, where I was drawn into a terrifyingly personal encounter with the unknown. The tale begins when I received a call from the Rosendale Police Department about a series of bizarre incidents. Cattle were found mutilated, crops were flattened in strange geometric patterns, and multiple townsfolk reported seeing odd lights in the night sky. The authorities were baffled, and the town was on edge. Upon arrival in Rosendale, I sensed a deep unease hanging in the air. The townsfolk were tight-lipped, their eyes telling tales of sleepless nights and fears unspoken. My first visit was to the local police station, where I was shown unsettling photographs of mutilated cattle and intricate crop circles. But the most chilling of all were the testimonies of the residents who had seen the mysterious lights in the sky. My investigation took me from one unsettling scene to another, but it was at the O'Hara farm where the true horror of Rosendale struck me. The O'Haras were a quiet, elderly couple who had lived in Rosendale all their lives. Their story was similar to the others, with one chilling exception. Mrs. O'Hara had disappeared for 3 nights before reappearing without any memory of where she had been. Their anxiety was palpable as they recounted their experience. That night, as I sat in the guest room offered by the O'Haras, my sleep was disturbed by a brilliant white light flooding the room. I rushed to the window and was greeted by an overwhelming sight. An enormous metallic craft, pulsating with lights of varying intensity, hung over the farm. A sense of dread washed over me as I remembered Mrs. O'Hara's blank expression when she spoke about her missing nights. Suddenly, the room started to shake, objects flying off shelves. It felt like an invisible force was pulling me toward the window. I fought to stay grounded, the deafening hum from the craft sending waves of pain through my head. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, and the room fell silent. When I woke up, it was morning. Shaken, I rushed to the O'Hara's room. They were there, but something was off. Their eyes were distant, their voices hollow. It was as if they had aged a decade overnight. In the days that followed, things grew progressively worse in Rosendale. More residents started showing signs similar to the O'Hara's, their life force seemingly sucked out. Each night the craft returned, its ominous presence looming over the town. I documented everything, sending reports back to my organization, but my notes, my videos, and my photographs all failed to capture the sheer terror that gripped Rosendale. With every passing day, the town seemed to be inching toward a disaster of unknown proportions. Finally, after a week of inexplicable horror, the craft disappeared. The nights in Rosendale returned to their peaceful state, but the damage had been done. Half the town was now in a state similar to the O'Hara's, their vitality sapped, their minds vacant. Despite my extensive documentation and reports, my superiors were skeptical, attributing the events to mass hysteria. Rosendale, once a lively town, was now a ghost town. Its residents were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, their once peaceful existence replaced by a nightmare they couldn't forget. I left Rosendale with a heavy heart, my mind burdened with the chilling encounter. Even today, years later, I wake up in the middle of the night, the image of the ominous craft looming over the O'Hara farm still fresh in my mind. Rosendale was a grim reminder that we might not be alone in the universe. But the real horror was not the encounter itself, but the aftermath, the lingering fear, and the haunted eyes of the town's residents. Close Encounters, The Harvest of Rosendale, was more than just a case for me. It was a terrifying brush with an unknown reality, a grim tale of a town forever changed. One ordinary Friday evening, my parents were out at a dinner party, and I was home alone. I was 14, and it was my first time staying alone overnight. I sprawled out on the sofa, munching on snacks, and binge-watching my favorite shows. The night was mine. Around 10 p.m., I heard the faint sound of a car engine stopping nearby. I brushed it off as a neighbor arriving home late and kept watching TV. A few minutes later, a soft knock at the front door caught my attention. Annoyed, I paused my show, got off the couch, and peered through the peephole. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. Standing at the door were 3 individuals dressed as clowns. Their makeup was smudged and grotesque. Their wide, eerily grinning mouths and hollow, staring eyes sent a chill down my spine. Figuring it was a prank, I decided to ignore them. I quietly retreated from the door, but the knocking grew louder, more persistent. That's when I noticed a detail that froze me in place. One of the clowns was holding a crowbar. Panicking, I rushed upstairs to my parents' bedroom, locking the door behind me. I dialed the police, my voice shaking with fear. The operator assured me officers were on their way. I peered out the window and saw the clowns prowling around the yard, one of them trying to pry open the windows. The clowns' movements were terrifyingly erratic, not like ordinary burglars. They waved towards the house, their smiles never faltering. I was paralyzed with terror watching them. The sound of sirens filled the night, and the clowns scrambled back to their car and sped away as the police pulled up. I breathed a sigh of relief and ran downstairs to unlock the front door. The police officers searched the premises and gathered evidence. They assured me they would do everything to catch the clowns. My parents arrived home soon after, horrified and regretful for leaving me alone. That night I didn't sleep. I kept seeing the grotesque faces of the clowns every time I closed my eyes. My home no longer felt safe. It was haunted by the horrifying memory of the night I was home alone with a gang of clowns trying to break in. The monsters weren't hiding under the bed. They were outside my door, their painted smiles mocking me from the shadows. I am an art collector. Antiques, relics, and paintings from bygone eras are my passion. Over the years, I've amassed a collection that ranges from the mundane to the downright bizarre. But it was one piece, a painting, that sent my life spiraling into a never-ending nightmare. I found it at an estate sale in a grand mansion tucked away in the English countryside. A portrait, it was of a young woman, her face framed by raven black hair, eyes hauntingly captivating, and a smile that held a melancholy I found unsettling. It was not a masterpiece by any means, but there was something about it, something that drew me in. I bought the painting, paying a sum so insignificant it felt like a theft. The old caretaker who handled the sale wished me a troubled goodbye, his gaze lingering on the painting with a mixture of fear and relief. I shrugged it off as the ramblings of an eccentric old man and brought the painting home. The first night was when I noticed the changes. The woman in the portrait, her eyes seemed to follow me, the smile slightly more sinister than I remembered. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, chalking it up to the flickering candles and my wild imagination. I was wrong. In the following days, I began to hear whispers, soft and seductive, always coming from the room where the painting was. I would find objects moved, doors left ajar, and every time the woman in the painting seemed to be watching, her smile a silent taunt. One evening, as I was engrossed in a book, I heard a soft giggle. I looked up to see the woman in the painting, her hand reaching out of the canvas, her eyes gleaming with an unholy light. I rubbed my eyes, sure it was a hallucination. But when I looked again, the woman was still reaching out, her painted hand inching towards me. Panic set in. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. But even from outside, I could hear the soft giggling and the whispers. That night I slept fitfully, the image of the reaching woman haunting my dreams. I decided to get rid of the painting. The next morning I tried to take it down, but the moment I touched it, an excruciating pain shot through me. The woman in the painting was laughing, her hand still outstretched. I could feel her icy touch on my hand, a cold, paralyzing sensation that left me gasping for air. In the following days, I was trapped in my own home, the woman in the painting ruling over my existence. She would sing at night, her voice a melancholic lullaby that echoed through the halls. I would see her walking in the corridors, her figure a dark blur. The only discernible feature was her gleaming eyes. Every attempt to destroy or abandon the painting ended in pain. It was a prisoner in my home, my life a waking nightmare. Even in my dreams, there was no escape. The woman haunted my sleep, her eyes always watching, her voice a constant whisper in my ears. I turned to the local priest in a desperate attempt to rid myself of the haunted painting. As soon as he entered my home, he recoiled, a look of sheer terror on his face. He refused to help. His only advice was to pray and leave the house. But I couldn't leave. The woman in the painting wouldn't let me. I was her captive, her plaything. The house became a haunting ground, the days filled with terror, the nights with bone-chilling fear. The whispers grew louder, the woman's presence more oppressive. Now I live at the mercy of the woman in the painting. Each day I can feel her icy touch, her fingers tracing down my spine. Each night I can hear her voice, a constant whisper in the dark. I am her prisoner, my life a chilling reflection of the melancholy in her smile. In my solitude, I write this as a warning. If you ever come across a painting of a raven-haired woman with captivating eyes and a melancholy smile, walk away. Don't make the same mistake I did. The painting is not a mere portrait. It is a window to a never-ending nightmare, a haunted canvas that entraps its owner. The whispers are growing louder now, the woman's laughter echoing through the house. As I finish writing this, I can feel her behind me, her icy touch on my shoulder, her breath a chilling whisper in my ear. This is my existence now, forever trapped in the haunting melody of a painted nightmare. I'm Jack, and I used to work the night shift at a 24/7 convenience store. Located on a deserted stretch of road, it was a quiet job, aside from the occasional trucker or late-night traveler. That was until one particularly chilling night. It was around midnight when a man walked in. He was tall, had a gaunt face, and wore a trench coat. His eyes, a piercing blue, were the most striking feature. He wandered through the aisles aimlessly, never picking anything up. After about 20 minutes, he approached the counter with an old Polaroid picture. It was of a young woman, presumably from the 70s or 80s. He asked if I had seen her. I told him I hadn't, and he seemed genuinely disappointed. Just after the man left, the store phone rang. A woman was on the other end. Her voice was shaky, and she sounded terrified. She asked if a man had just been in the store with a picture. I confirmed that he had, and she let out a sob. She told me the picture was of her mother who disappeared 30 years ago, and that the man with the picture was the primary suspect. Just as I was about to ask the woman more questions, I saw the man's face outside the window. He was back, standing in the parking lot, staring at me. I hung up and locked the store's door, but he continued to stand outside, holding up the picture. I retreated to the back of the store, hiding behind shelves as I dialed the police. They said they would be there as soon as they could. I kept peeking around the corner, and each time the man was still there, unmoving, watching. Finally, the flashing lights of a police cruiser cut through the darkness. Officers approached the man, talking briefly before handcuffing him. As they took him away, he dropped the Polaroid. It fluttered slowly to the ground, the young woman's image staring back at me. The police later told me the man was indeed a person of interest in a long unsolved case. Working a lonely shift at a convenience store, I never thought I would cross paths with someone linked to a decades-old mystery. From then on, every late-night customer carried an air of unease, a lingering fear that behind their mundane purchases, they could hide chilling secrets just as the man with the Polaroid had. The events of that night made it hard for me to return to my normal routine. The once peaceful stillness of the night now echoed with a spine-chilling silence. I began to dread every customer that walked through the door after dark. A few days later, a woman who introduced herself as Detective Laura Jensen visited the store. She was working on the case involving the man with the Polaroid. Detective Jensen asked me a series of questions about the man's demeanor and his actions, jotting down notes as I relayed the ordeal. She then showed me a different picture of the woman from the Polaroid. Her name was Sarah, a bright college student with her whole life ahead of her when she mysteriously disappeared. The case had gone cold, but the sudden reappearance of the suspect brought it back to the spotlight. In the following weeks, I started receiving eerie anonymous letters at the store. The handwriting was shaky, and the messages were disturbing, saying things like, "She's still here," or "Don't trust her." It made me wonder if the man had somehow found a way to contact me, or if there was someone else. I began to feel watched, especially during my shifts. It was as if Sarah's unsolved mystery had started to cast a shadow over me. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being pulled into something much bigger and far more dangerous. One night, my personal cell phone rang with an unknown number calling. I hesitated, then answered. There was heavy breathing on the other end, followed by a whisper, "You're next." The line went dead. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I was officially scared. I informed Detective Jensen about the calls and letters. She advised me to be cautious and assured me they were ramping up their investigation. But I couldn't escape a gnawing suspicion when I remembered one of the letters. "Don't trust her." I was caught in a web of fear and mystery, uncertain of who to trust. My once peaceful job had turned into a living nightmare, where every customer, every phone call, and even the helpful detective could pose a threat. Little did I know that the real horror was yet to come. One late shift, I got an anonymous tip through a phone call. The voice was garbled, but I made out a meeting point, the abandoned warehouse outside town, and a promise that it would all end tonight. A pit in my stomach told me it was a trap, but I was desperate to end this. I informed Detective Jensen about the tip, but she advised against going. Her warning echoed in my mind as I drove towards the warehouse, the darkness seeming to close in around me. I knew I was stepping into potential danger, but the fear of living in constant paranoia was worse. As I arrived, the warehouse loomed ominously against the moonlit sky. I made my way inside, my heart pounding. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and there he was, the man from the store, his eyes just as chilling. But this time, he had a menacing smile on his face. His cold laughter echoed through the warehouse as he advanced toward me. "You're next," he repeated, his voice seeping with threat. I froze, my mind racing. Was this the end? Just as he was within arm's reach, a gunshot echoed through the warehouse. The man crumpled to the ground. Detective Jensen emerged from the shadows, gun in hand, her expression steely. After that night, everything happened in a whirl. It was revealed that the man was Sarah's ex-boyfriend, suspected but never convicted for her disappearance. His obsession with her had driven him to madness, leading him to stalk anyone he thought was helping solve the case. Despite the horror ending, the ordeal left a lasting impact. I couldn't shake off the memories, the fear, and the fact that I had been so close to becoming his next victim. The trauma led me to leave my job, moving far away from everything that reminded me of that nightmare. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that fear can find you anywhere, even in the most mundane, everyday places. And when it does, it doesn't always come as a shadowy figure in the night. Sometimes, it's just a regular customer buying a pack of gum.